Hey, my name's David, and today I'm going to give a 6-minute talk on renewable energy in the power grid. So, on the power grid, these are the four main sources of renewable or clean energy. We have hydropower, solar energy, wind power, and nuclear energy. There are some other ones being developed, such as tidal energy, but those are kind of still in development and still aren't on a large scale. So for hydropower, you're basically running water, moving water past the turbine, which is going to spin that shaft, and then interact with the generator to produce that electricity. There's two main ways to do this. In that diagram over there, you can see the storage system, where you essentially have a large reservoir and a large head on one side of that turbine, and then you essentially release the water, it flows downhill past that turbine, and therefore produces that electricity. In the other version, you set it up next to a river, and you actually divert some of that river water off to the side, and you run it past that turbine and accomplish the same result. So for solar energy, usually when we're talking about solar power, we're talking about a photovoltaic cell. And basically, that is two semiconductors sat next to each other. And when the solar energy hits the semiconductors, it essentially releases some electrons. And those free electrons travel upward toward the surface where the sun is hitting. And then that essentially creates a voltage differential that can essentially supply power. So when you connect those two terminals that are at different charges, you can essentially run electrons through that wire and create electricity. Then for wind power, much like the water or the hydropower, you essentially have a fluid moving past the turbine and then interacting with the generator to produce electricity. In this case, the wind turbines are very, very high, so they can get all that wind up high, and they're actually able to spin on their tower, and the blades can change in pitch to maximize that efficiency. For nuclear energy, this is actually one of my personal favorites. It's one of the coolest, I think. It's actually nothing more than a simple Rankine cycle, except that the heat comes from nuclear fission. You're breaking those bonds in the nucleus of that atom and releasing that energy. There are actually two versions of this. One is the boiling water method, where essentially the water that's in the reactor is going through the turbines and the condenser and all that kind of stuff, so it's only a single loop of water. The other version is the pressurized water, where essentially you have two streams of water or two loops of water. So you have one essentially radioactive water loop that is essentially exchanging heat with another loop that's going through the turbine. So the radioactive water actually never reaches the turbine or the other devices. So this graph right here shows energy usage in the United States over a number of years. As you can see, renewable energy, which is that green, and nuclear energy, which is the red, is on the rise, which has an obvious benefit. However, it does come with some interesting challenges as far as when we go to the grid. In the grid, a little bit of background. I actually found this really cool. The energy that we are currently using in this room to power lights, or to power the camera, or the computer, or whatever, is actually generated only a fraction of a second before we actually use it. Energy storage, at least right now, is kind of inefficient. So it's actually more cost effective to generate the electricity a fraction of a second before we use it, and then immediately bring it to its user. So because that's the way that the grid operates, when you go to the actual power stations, they essentially have to ramp up and down the production of their various energy generator to account for this demand. An interesting challenge is that we don't tell them when the lights are going to go on, we don't tell them when the computer's going to go on, so they basically have to look at the patterns day to day and essentially predict what the demand will be at a certain time of day. Now, I'm forgetting the word now. For the old style of power generation, where you have essentially combustion of fossil fuels, you can essentially ramp up production as much as you need at any time of day. But for renewable sources, it's actually a bit more challenging because things like solar or wind can be a bit more unpredictable. And sometimes they are intermittent through the day, and they essentially have to account for that whenever they're generating electricity. So here's a graph of essentially the demand versus generation. It has a nickname duck curve because it's kind of shaped like a little duck. I have a little picture on the side there just for reference. So that blue line is the demand, in this case California, of power throughout a 24-hour cycle. And you can see that in the mornings it's relatively low, and then it starts to rise to a peak in the afternoons or evenings. Below, that little gray line, is the solar generation. And you can see that as the sun rises, it starts to ramp up and reaches a peak around noon, and then dips back down. So solar energy is, of course, a very good source of energy. However, you can see in that orange line, which is essentially that blue line minus that gray line, it creates this essentially dip in the amount of generation of power that the other sources have to generate. And when we go into the evenings and the solar energy starts to dip back down, you have that sharp ramp up on that orange line. And essentially at that point, all of the other power generators, the standard old style power generators, have to essentially make up the difference and essentially have to ramp up power production insanely quickly in order to meet that new demand. So before we had solar power, that blue line was kind of a good enough ramp that we could essentially meet that demand by the normal power means. But as soon as you introduce solar, and especially in California where solar power generates a lot of their percentage of electricity, all of a sudden that's a sharp ramp that you can't really climb by conventional means. So we essentially create this problem when we have renewable sources on the grid of how do we account for that ramp and how do we essentially work around it. And the main way that we work around it is through energy storage. Instead of having all of the solar power that's being generated at that moment going toward the grid, you can essentially store it somewhere so that you can use it later when we have that peak in demand. And that allows the other generators to essentially have less of a tax when we're trying to ramp up that production. Most of the energy storage is actually done by something called pump storage, and that's essentially where you have two reservoirs of water, as you can see on the left, or sorry, on the right there, and you essentially have a basin of water at the bottom that you can pump up to a higher reservoir, and you are essentially storing that energy in gravitational potential energy. So when you want to release that energy, you essentially just open up the channel, the water runs down through the turbine, and you essentially have a hydropower plant. But because it's essentially reversible, it basically acts as essentially the world's largest battery. There also are conventional batteries, however, on the large scale of the grid, it's not always as useful. There is more, batteries are being developed for grid scale projects, and they're also being developed for smaller devices such as cars, so we can use that more efficiently. And these are my citations, and that's about it. Thank you.